Thank you for coming to our presentation. Wayne, Sean and I will be discussing the topics of an article that we published earlier on this year that examined the experiences of international academic staff as they attempt to acculturate into a UK university. Okay, well, the higher education sector is increasingly global in nature. There's a significant cross-border movement of students, although it's mostly from east to west or the south to the north, depending on how you call it. But we should also forget that there are Erasmus Plus programs and transatlantic programs and similar programs that provide international experiences for UK students as well. And then the internet and huge publishing industry encourages and supports the publication and exchange of ideas internationally through journals and articles. Although again, this is often seen as dominated by an Anglophone agenda or Anglophone interests. But particularly relevant here, there's movement of international staff as well, both in terms of short-term schemes like the visiting professors or long-term employment on permanent contracts for staff that have been recruited overseas. Now, as you'd expect, and I think most of us would agree, the rhetoric presents internationalization as a good thing. The exchange of ideas can only be enriching, either adding new knowledge or refining our existing knowledge sets. And the diversity approaches that international staff bring is a catalyst for us to develop new ways of seeing and understanding. So I think internationalization undoubtedly has great potential. We shouldn't forget, though, that international brings other benefits too. The global nature of HE makes it a very competitive sector, and this competition, in this competition, international students are a rich source of income. Also, the international university rankings include in their assessment an evaluation of the institution's internationalization. This is usually measured in terms of the number of overseas students, the numbers of joint publications between the institution's staff and staff from overseas institutions, and the proportion of international staff employed by the institution. And it's this latter that we're interested in here. The HACER figures suggest that 30% of academic staff within the UK are of non-UK nationality. And clearly the role of international staff, international academic staff in helping an institution to internationalize is important. It's generally assumed that the international staff bring new ideas and experiences which enrich academic debate. And they can also help in supporting international students, and they can be instrumental in developing international collaborations according to the literature. However, there's limited research into this topic itself to actually see whether this is the case. Most research into internationalization focuses on the student experience. And while that's informative, it's not exactly the same. There is some research. Christoph and Minocha in Bournemouth suggest that a global academic workforce could be seen as a rich source of cultural, pedagogic and academic experience, and they call for more investigation into the topic, some of which was done by Minocha herself. And she found that while staff felt they had good working relationships with their colleagues, there could be much better support to help international academic staff adjust to teaching in the UK. And notice the direction here of that adjustment, the international staff who would adjust to teaching in the UK. And that's not just their academic role as well. It's not just support for the professional role, but the participants also expressed a need for support for life outside the institution. For example, things as simple as or as straightforward as setting up a bank account. And the research here I'm presenting develops from a presentation that was done by Wayne, Claudia Bodogna and Helena Harvey, and was presented at a conference in 2016. And it has three particular aims. Well, the aim is the main aim, overall aim, is to explore the international academic staff's experience. Specifically, it's looking for an understanding of the subjective experiences of international academic staff joining a UK university. It aims to consider their impressions of the institution's openness and orientation to cultural diversity, and it wants to consider their impressions of the extent to which they feel they're able to contribute. Institutionalized internationalization is actually quite diverse. Jane Knight has identified what she terms 3 generations of internationalisation. The first generation, which is probably the most common one, is referred to as the classic model, is where the range of international activities, the number of international students, and the number of international staff are just generally increased within the institution. In contrast, you've got the second generation, which she calls the satellite model, and this is where an institution creates centres around the world, and these can be research centres, they could be offshore teaching, or they could actually be mini campuses. And then the third generation is of internationally co-founded universities. So clearly the term internationalisation can mean many different things in terms of context. And so potentially this can also affect how internationalisation is actually performed and the role that international academic staff play within that. Internationalisation is often defined in terms of the qualities that an internationalised institution will teach to the students. According to Bennett and Bennett, it's both a mindset and a skill set of intercultural abilities. Someone who's internationalised is able to appreciate and also assimilate knowledge acquired from other cultural and linguistic experiences, and then apply this experience and this knowledge in going forward. What's important though is that they see it as transformational. Specifically, they see it as a change in identity. And so if we transfer that concept across to the institution, then we see it too as a transformative process for the institution, not simply an end in itself. Simply increasing the numbers of international academic staff doesn't transform the institution though. And the institution needs to consider how international staff are integrated into the teaching and research community, and also how that community adapts to include them. What research there is so far, however, suggests that few international academic staff feel this has been done successfully. There's generally a feeling from the international academic staff that their previous experiences and knowledge, especially their professional abilities and skills, are not recognised by the new institution. In fact, there seems to be an expectation that the international academic staff will change their pedagogies and reconfigure their professional skills to fit in. And this can actually be quite structurally mandated. For example, some institutions have requirements about obtaining a PGC HE or fellowship of the HEA. And the way that these courses are often delivered is more of an instruction in the accepted patterns of behaviour and teaching styles that will be expected of the staff, rather than encouraging a discussion between diversely well experienced practitioners who are sharing their good practice. International academic staff do, however, usually suggest that they found their colleagues to be welcoming and supportive informally. But despite this, there's often otherwise a weak induction process with staff expected to take part pretty much fully from the very beginning. And there's limited, if any, organised induction or probation. Often there's an assumption that the staff will know or quickly understand how systems work, despite the UK HE, according to the literature, being quite bureaucratic in the way it works. Similarly, international academic staff themselves often assume that they can participate in the same way that they worked previously without considering whether to adapt their practices or their teaching styles. And what's particular in all the literature, though, is that there's very little recognition for the implicit cultural values within the systems and the patterns of the sector. One particular area that's been mentioned in terms of the UK for international academic staff is the different teacher-student relationship, given the UK's student as consumer approach. Some of the literature there ends with recommendations for what an institution needs to do in order to support acculturation of the international academic staff and to develop the international agenda that this is all linked to. However, there's very little in more than ideas of a full and structured induction process, and it's usually that vaguely stated, and a vague call for space to discuss. It's usually recognised, though, that this is probably something that should be passed on to all staff, not just international academic staff, and that many home staff equally feel at sea when they first arrive in a new institution. And also that it should be recognise that home staff have to make some changes to be internationalised as well. But all these suggestions don't recognise the complexity of acculturation, the tensions between knowing the system and just simply conforming to it, the extent to which staff can and should adapt their professional identities, and the interaction between the institutional expectations and transformations and the expectations and transformations of the staff member haven't really been looked at or explored. And so it was exploring these experiences, particularly how it was seen, the acculturation process was seen by the international academic staff, that this research sought to try and look at. At this point, I think I've finished, and I'm going to hand over to Wayne, who will look more closely at the research done and for the article and explain the theoretical framework and methodology.
Thanks for that, Glynn. Glynn gave a brief introduction to this study and gave a reasonably detailed overview of some of the literature that already exists that's looked at similar elements. What I'm going to do now is give you an indication of the framework that we use to help us to collect the data, but also to interrogate the data that we collected. And then I'll go on to tell you a little bit about the methodological approach that we followed within this study. So in terms of the framework, we adopted Berry's bi-dimensional fourfold model of acculturation. And we used it to consider the different strategies that the international academic staff undertook. And we used it to help us to analyse their intercultural experience. But we also used it to map how the participants perceived their employers and the particular acculturation strategies that their employer followed. We're not alone in using Berry's framework. It's been used many different times to study sojourners, refugees, immigrants and other native peoples, to name but a few. It's a well-used thing. So in terms of the framework, we really used it as a thinking tool to help us to contemplate the different acculturation strategies of both the international academic staff, which we viewed as being the non-dominants, but also of the dominant society, which in this occasion we labelled the particular UK HEI, the case HEI, which we've discussed throughout this particular paper. So in terms of Berry's model, there are two dimensions that actually intersect to create four acculturation categories. So we labelled the strategies of ethnocultural groups as the international academic staff, and we labelled the strategies of the larger society as the UK HEI. So throughout this research, we mapped the strategies utilised by the participants, so whether they had a strategy to integrate, to assimilate, to separate, or to marginalise. And we also mapped their perceptions of what their employers followed in terms of the employers' acculturation strategies. So whether they were multicultural, whether they created a melting pot, whether they whether the segregation, or whether they really excluded the international academic staff. So like I said, we considered the international academic staff to be the non-dominant group, and Berry defines this group as an acculturating people who face four different acculturation strategies, and the strategies that they choose are pretty much based on their preference to either maintain their own cultural heritage and their own identity, or whether they have a preference to connect and to participate within the larger, more dominant society. So Berry's model therefore enabled us to consider the extent to which our international academic staff felt able to maintain their existing culture behaviour while engaging in day-to-day interaction, so integration, whether they were unwilling to maintain their cultural identity, preferring to acquire the dominant group's characteristics, so assimilation, whether they were separated from other cultures, and whether they were able to maintain their own values, so separation, and whether they were whether there was an enforced cultural loss, so they were unwilling to have relations with others due to discrimination or isolation, so marginalisation. But as I mentioned, we also considered the strategies that were undertaken by the higher education institution, and we considered those to be the larger society. So the acculturation strategy that the HEI undertook played a significant part in any strategy that the international academic staff were able to adopt themselves, which is why we were interested in their perceptions of their HEI and the perceptions of what acculturation strategies that they felt the HEI followed. So we wanted to try and find out how the case institution influenced the way in which the acculturation process took place. So we were interested in whether they thought their HEI embraced and embedded openness and diversity as a key feature of the HEI's environment, and whether it showed a willingness in terms of process and policy modification, so whether it was deemed to be multicultural, whether the HEI sought to assimilate and create a fusion of nationalities, cultures and ethnicities, so whether it was a melting pot in their opinion, whether their HEI forced their separation, so segregation, or whether their HEI imposed marginalisation on them, so exclusion. So we very much use this framework, and as I've said, as a thinking tool to help us think about what our participants were saying. In terms of methodological approaches, I'm sure is clear by now, we focused on a single post-92 HEI. To be eligible for the study, participants needed to be international academic staff members that had less than 5 years teaching experience within UK higher education. So this was a qualitative study. We used semi-structured interviews to gather data about the participants' experience. So we asked things about the time in the UK, qualifications, any previous and current roles and responsibilities, but we were particularly interested in any challenges that they'd come across and witnessed during their employment, particularly with the present HEI. So at the time, there were 181 international academic staff on the university payroll. We interviewed 20, which meaning that 11.5% of the institution's international academic staff participated. And on the table to the right, it gives an indication of their country of origin and their gender. So in terms of the interview questions, we devised them in order to be able to elicit the extent to which the various strategies were evident within the participants' testimony and narrative within their interviews. So integration, assimilation, separation, marginalisation. But we also asked questions that allowed us to find out how they perceived their employer and their employer's acculturation strategies as well. So in terms of the questions that we asked, they were designed to lead the direction of the discussion to the participants. We didn't lead, we just really tried to see where the conversations went, and we got lots of rich, interesting data. To make sure that we were interpreting the data as well as we could, we read the transcripts over many different occasions to try and make sure that we'd got the correct meanings and different patterns in relation to Berry's model. So the testimony was always considered with Berry's model in mind. So any themes pertaining to events that took place, their realities, the meanings and the experiences that the participants had were identified and they were coded, and then we used bearer guidelines throughout the actual research. So that comes to the end of my section. So now I'm going to hand you over to Sean, who's going to tell you a little bit about our findings, the discussion that took place within the paper, and to offer some conclusions before we are able to answer any of your questions. So thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Wayne, and good afternoon, everybody. So as Wayne has already said, I'm going to talk through the findings, discussion and the conclusions of the study. So upon the analysis of the data, we found that we could categorize it under two broad themes: international academic staff acculturation strategies and international academic staff's perceptions of their HEI's openness and inclusivity. And within these themes, there are both positives and negatives from the perspective of the IAS. Okay, the first collection of thoughts under acculturation strategies is the bureaucratic processes of the institution. And this was a double-edged sword, really. So international staff felt that acculturation was hampered by either too much bureaucratic process or not enough bureaucracy at the university. They felt that, generally speaking, there was an over-reliance on process and procedure, and this reduced the autonomy of them as international academic staff. Conversely, and somewhat paradoxically, some international academic staff felt that there was a lack of process and procedure, and indeed a lack of guidelines, particularly in areas relating to how to deal with students. Okay, the second collection of concerns around the under the acculturation strategies theme is the differences in approaches to teaching and assessment, and this made it difficult for some international staff to acculturate. So those are differences in approaches to teaching and assessment in the UK from the home country of the academic staff. IAS also reported difficulties in balancing the requirements of teaching, research and administration. And we appreciate that, you know, you don't need to be an international member of staff to have difficulty balancing those things. But in this case, the interviewees talked about that as being created by cultural differences. Okay, so being adaptable and flexible were highly valued by international staff. And there was a kind of perception that the university and university processes were a kind of unchanging monolith in some ways. So the university was seen as being somewhat inflexible and unchanging. And this quote from one of the interviewees kind of sums up this attitude. So the university cannot change, so you have to adapt. So that a high value placed on being flexible, being able to adapt to an inflexible institution. A particularly important and interesting finding that emerged was the strategy of building relationships. So international academic staff building relationships with other faculty members. And this was born out of a desire to feel connected with other people and the institution. International academic staff talked about things such as building informal relationship with good-natured members of staff. So, you know, as you can imagine, international staff were looking to form relationships with friendly people in their department usually. And such international colleagues spoke about this as these relationships as making up for the shortcomings of the HEI. So if the processes and procedures of the institution couldn't be relied upon to provide any answers, then you know, friendly colleagues, relationships with friendly colleagues would fill this gap. Such relationships were not initiated by formal mechanisms of the institution, but they were initiated by the international academic staff as a matter of necessity. So these weren't necessarily born out of meeting people at induction events or anything like that, but they were relationships that were created by international academic staff. Okay, so regarding these relationships with other members of staff, international academic staff were aware that there was a potential for these relationships to be over-relied upon, and for international academic staff to come to be perceived to be overbearing or overwhelming sometimes. So relationships that develop between international academic staff and colleagues to assist transition may create tensions within teams and departments. And, you know, again, paradoxically, the purpose of these relationships from the international academic staff's point of view was to kind of help them integrate and settle into the institution. But sometimes this perception of being overbearing and overwhelming, you know, created a sort of tension where IAS became reluctant to ask for help. And ultimately, this might lead to international academic staff separating themselves from other colleagues. All right, so international staff don't want to be perceived as being burdensome to colleagues. So they, you know, if these relationships go wrong or go too far, international academic staff might feel the need to separate themselves from other colleagues. Okay, there's also a perceived lack of support amongst IAS for pedagogical practice. So many international academic staff mentioned things like, you know, that they felt that their pedagogic tradition was teacher-centered, while the UK experience, relatively speaking, is a student-centered environment. So they also felt that the HEI, they were operating in an environment where it was kind of felt that to offer support to international academic staff around their teaching practice could be felt to be could be an offensive intervention. It was to question their capability as teachers. However, our study suggested that international staff were actually looking for academic support. They would have welcomed that. Okay, so moving on to the theme of perceptions of openness and inclusivity from the HEI. Generally speaking, international academic staff felt that diversity was accepted and indeed encouraged in the HEI. However, many of our interviewees felt that international student comfort and support was a higher priority than their own as members of staff. So participants felt that some support was available to international academic staff, but this was nothing like the ongoing and comprehensive support offered to international students. So international academic staff clearly thinking that the internationalization agenda of the HEI is clearly directed at students. Typically, study participants expected much more from their employer, suggesting such things as peer mentoring schemes, prolonged inductions, and staff development that embraced cultural differences, etc. So they were looking for much more input and prolonged induction periods than were currently on offer. Again, going back to our comments about bureaucracy in the institution, all the participants expressed the need for resources that would help them demystify processes and procedures and the procedural languages used at the university. They also felt that the expectations of them as academic staff should be clearer from the outset. And they felt that this was a bit of a barrier to engage with academic life. Again, international academic staff relied on informal networks and relationships to plug the gaps left by the institution. And again, regarding these things, this could lead to what they felt was an over-reliance on fellow staff members, those tensions arriving again, and ultimately a strategy of separation being adopted by international academic staff. Okay, so here's some very brief summings up of what we found in our study. So international academic staff are willing to integrate and adopt the values of the dominant group. Many international academic staff feel that their previous experiences of teaching and learning and research have little academic capital within their new HEI. And the majority felt that the UK HEI was doing little to meet the needs of a diverse international group of scholars. Again, many felt the need for additional support to navigate new structures and procedures of their UK HEI. Many felt that induction processes are too generic and vague. There's not much of a focus on their international status, if you like. That our induction processes at the UK HEI were felt to be just kind of aimed at the lowest common denominator. Some international academic staff felt there was prejudice against their otherness, their status as others, as outsiders. And to an extent, there's a benign neglect where the HEI assumes that international academic staff will integrate into the workplace along the same lines as domestic academic staff. This suggests an assumption that there is no need to make specific adjustments for international staff. Okay, so participants called for norms to be demystified and for the institution to engage in a process that allows them to work efficiently and successfully. There's a great deal of reliance by international academic staff as a deliberate strategy on other colleagues to give them informal support, although they do think this should be actually provided more formally by the institution. This benign neglect suggests that the HEI is unsure of its own acculturation strategy, which may unconsciously impede the acculturation processes of international academic staff. Many thanks. Do we have any questions?
Yes, I just want to say thanks to Sean and Glynn and Wayne for the presentations, and I will have been monitoring the questions coming in. I think you published, and I think we'll start with the first question from Hazel Bryan, saying there is a body of recent work that challenges the value and reality of multiculturalism, arguing that it emphasises difference. In Berry's 2008 model, is there an assumption that multiculturalism is positive or is a reality? And is that how you applied the concept? And I think Wayne might be responding to this.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Hazel. I guess in terms of Berry's model, it is viewed as being a positive broadly. In terms of our work, as I've said, we use the model loosely just to try and see what was going on within the specific HEI. And what was clear to me is that many of the issues that the international academic staff were wanting weren't necessarily much different to what any new member of staff were really wanting. They weren't wanting to be singled out as different, as you allude to. They weren't wanting to be seen as different at all, really. They just wanted help in terms of the various procedures and processes that they were asked to follow, which were particularly alien. I think the main thing that they really needed the help with is that there was an assumption that because they were academic members of staff from elsewhere generally, they were well educated, they were very often had a great body of research already. There was an expectation that they would know how to deal with all of this, that they would know how to deal with very different bureaucracy, very different processes, very different procedures. And they just didn't, and that really made them feel quite marginalised in many instances.
Thanks, Wayne. There's another question here from Helen Jones asking about whether there were any patterns of difference between the different countries of origin or the regions, and whether there were any gender differences. I don't know whether Sean or Glynn or Wayne want to talk about the findings that relate to that.
I mean, I can start. I'm sure that Sean will pick up some of this. There wasn't a great degree of difference in terms of gender. Many of the themes were similar, whether or not it was male or female. It was, as I've said, as Sean alluded to, much of the issues were around, I guess, fitting in, bureaucracy, feeling unable to ask questions. Some of the findings Sean alludes to talks about well-meaning, helpful academic members of staff, and what they all said about them is that they felt able to go to them and utilise their expertise for a while, but that very quickly they felt that they were a burden to them, and that wasn't different from any of the participants. I think there was probably a difference in terms of nationality, in terms of some of the European nations were much more akin in terms of dealing with students and dealing with issues and dealing with a degree of bureaucracy in the same way that we were, but some of the South Asian respondents, it was completely alien to them. And I remember one particular participant saying, why do we ask students anything? Why do we care what students think? They don't even know what they think. Why are we asking them what they think about us? So many of the South Asian, or the few that were in the actual data, found all of this far more alien than some of the EU and European countries. Although there was one particular quote that I always like, and it didn't end up in the paper, and it was from an Italian participant who said that she felt she had to tone down her Italianness in terms of things like that. So there were some differences, but it was only a small number of participants, I think, to really hone in on some of the subtle nuances that there clearly will have been. As we allude in the paper, there's certainly some opportunity to take this wider. And I guess I'll finish finally by saying either Sean or Glynn alluded to a paper that I delivered with a couple of colleagues, which was a precursor to this. And at the end of it, this gentleman came up to me, and I actually thought he was upset with what we had to say in the presentation. And he actually he teared up, and he just thanked us because he thought he was the only person who had been dealing with these things, and he was at a different HEI. So I think there's certainly some follow-up to do, and certainly some follow-up that might help us to highlight any subtleties around gender and around nationality. But given the small number of participants, there was nothing that really stood out. Anything to add, Sean or Glynn?
Yeah, I just concur with that, Wayne. I think, given the relatively small number, it's difficult to draw patterns beyond, the international nature of participants. However, I would agree with Wayne and say, it looks like the further east participants were from, the more they were likely to report or likely to talk about this feeling of otherness. So I guess that's a term that was popularized by Edward Said in his work on Orientalism. So I think those colleagues from further east might be more prone to that kind of othering process. I just agree with Wayne again that I think that there's plenty of the work could be done here, around gender, around not only international status but the racial status of participants. But all this is potential stuff. That's the next paper, I think.
That's great. I think that probably answered that question. There's another question from an anonymous participant asking about clarification around the terms, suggesting that is it right that assimilation is accepting the host and rejecting the home culture, integration is accepting the host and retaining the home culture, whereas separation is rejecting host and retaining home culture, and then marginalisation is rejecting both, and just wondering whether they've understood that right. So not sure who wants to take that clarification on.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much as is. So, I mean, what I would advise is if in the paper we go into it in a little bit more detail, and we actually try and link some of the specifics of those concepts to the actual narrative that's in there. But in terms of the anonymous question, yeah, that's pretty much there. Yeah.
And then there's a follow-up question to Barry's model, again, talking about whether the model is actually sufficiently cognizant of structural issues, or whether it compartmentalizes a bit too neatly what's a complex and shifting experience across situations.
So there's a question at 4:45 on a Wednesday afternoon. I think the simple answer is, with many models, it does simplify some very complex things. But equally, I'm sure if Barry was here arguing for his model, he would say that it's probably we three who have simplified some particularly concepts and some particularly, interesting and detailed concepts. So yeah, I think it is a fair point. To be honest, we were just looking for a model that would help us to think about some of the things that our participants were telling us, and that's what it does. But it's certainly a fair argument and criticism, if that's what it is, about probably how we use Barry rather than Barry's model per se. Although that said, there are quite a lot of criticisms about Barry's model in itself. I mean, I think Hazel mentioned the 2008 model. There is a previous model as well, and obviously it's updated, but that is a fair thing to say. And
I guess it might be a good one to return to again, Hazel, and I think you mentioned this, Sean, in some of the findings, is really about recommendations. What could we do about the environment? And I think Hazel here is thinking about our school, because obviously we also have international staff and the university has international staff. Are there lessons to be learned, actions to be taken?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think definitely. I think the big takeaway is that we as a UK HEIs, generalising from the findings a little bit there, but we need to be much more proactive, and we need to be in our engagement with international academic staff. We have to offer more meaningful inductions that go more beyond just the generic basic introductions to the university. And I think as well, these the inductions that we offer have got to be, I'm going to use the word protracted, but that sounds slightly pejorative, doesn't it? They have to be longer. I think we need staged inductions for international academic staff. And we need to recognise that international academic staff they're actually looking for support and input from us as colleagues. I guess, we're a little bit, as HEIs and as individuals, we're a little bit standoffish because we don't want to offend colleagues by suggesting that they don't know what they're doing. But a lot of the time, international academic staff are looking for that kind of intervention. So I know that's a bit of a vague answer, but we need to find ways to allow colleagues to form these kind of relationships, offer that kind of support without the perception being that international academic staff are some kind of overbearing burden upon domestic staff.
Could I just add something to that as well, please, quickly? I mean, what was clear to me is when we undertook this research, it was at a particular time when our university's policy was very much about recruiting international academic staff who had very often a research pedigree. And as I mentioned a little bit in a previous question, they were coming into the various schools and to all intents and purposes been treated, or the appearance was, like any other academic member of staff coming in, whether they were from the UK or whether they were from around the world. And whilst they didn't want to be singled out as different, what they did want is some background about things. And I mentioned the South Asian participants. They were not against student satisfaction, or they were not against giving detailed feedback to students more than they were expected. They weren't against the fact that in their country, as they quoted, it was survival of the fittest. But they just needed a little bit of justification and explanation as to why. And I think very much they were told, because this is how we do it here. type thing. So I think some link to what Sean said about induction, to some justification, some cultural background in terms of our student base, who our students are, what they need from us, what the university needs, I think would be very helpful to any international member of academic staff who came to any school.
We've got a suggestion from Aileen, so that's great. So Aileen's just suggested that it would be organising induction in digestible doses, keeping in mind all the kind of bureaucratic procedures are going to be sort of raining on the heads of the newly recruited, as she's saying. So I guess a sort of bite-sized perhaps approach is what she's suggesting, rather than, so more a long induction rather than a larger one at the beginning. I was just wondering, from your presentation, it sounds like, Wayne, you were just saying that obviously internationalisation was on the agenda, and it sounds very much like from the findings that it was a very one-way process, whereas perhaps people think about internationalisation as in what could we actually learn from the international staff that are coming to our organisations. Is that a perspective that you found?
Yeah, it really was. I think, I mean, something we perhaps could have mentioned is all of these participants were on the PGCHE, in terms of they were relatively new to the university and new to teaching in the sense that they'd had less than 5 years. And what they really found that if we looked at pedagogy, the idea from the university and the school was that we would send them on a PGCHE and all would be revealed. And of course, it's not all revealed there. Whilst we might give them strategies on how to engage large groups and how to, you know, enhance their experience within there, it doesn't really go into it from a cultural perspective of why it's important to do so. So whilst we gave them band-aids and strategies and skill sets, what we didn't really do was spend a lot of time thinking about or talking about why we had to consider things this way. So I think it certainly is something that we could do and learn from them. And what many of them talked about is, look, I've had 10 years experience potentially in some instances in my university, and yet my expertise is not really recognised as well as what it might be. So as you allude to, Kathleen, I think it's something we need to consider. But just finally, just nipping back to something that Aileen said, which is really important, and it came out of our research, is that an elongated approach to this. You know, induction is not just 2 weeks, welcome, it's nice to see you, crack on, enjoy. You know, an induction should be a more, you know, as I've said, elongated over time, different things. And what many of the international academic staff wanted is almost what they call a one-stop shop, if you like, somewhere they felt able to go and talk to without feeling like they were putting upon or were, oh, I'm here again asking the same questions. So there's certainly something in that for sure. Sean, Glynn, anything to add?
That's a good summary, Wayne. Yeah. I mean, I think just to finish the thought there, if I may, following on from Wayne, I think were we to write this paper again, I'd be less inclined to use the phrase benign neglect. I think I'd just remove the benign. So I think you know, paralleling a lot of work around kind of you know, inclusivity, particularly around the racial identities. I think the institutions are either part of the problem or part of the solution. So you can't kind of say, well, we're neglecting staff, but it's from a good place. You know, let's just get on board with this.
Okay, well, I think that's probably concludes all the questions. So I just want to say thanks to all the presenters for a really fascinating research presentation, and to all the participants and the great questions, and for a successful online seminar.